Disney has canceled one of its upcoming live-action remakes after Snow White flopped. And I bet some fans are going to be pretty disappointed by this news.
What happens when the world's biggest entertainment empire admits it got it wrong? The entertainment industry is still reeling from Disney's unprecedented decision to abandon its entire live-action remake strategy. This seismic shift didn't happen overnight. It was the culmination of years of creative mismanagement that finally came to a head with the disastrous Snow White remake. What began as another routine nostalgia cash grab spiraled into a full-blown corporate crisis that exposed the fatal flaws in Disney's strategy. The complete story reveals how arrogance, creative bankruptcy, and contempt for audience intelligence combined to destroy Disney's most reliable money-making machine.
I think it's fair to say that no one on the right side of America can stand the star of this movie.
The roots of the disaster trace back to Disney's fateful decision to cast Rachel Zegler as Snow White, a choice that would come to symbolize the studio's fundamental misunderstanding of its own legacy. On paper, Zegler appeared to be the perfect casting coup. A fresh-faced, immensely talented Oscar winner from West Side Story, with powerhouse vocals and acting chops to spare. Disney's marketing team initially celebrated the PR gold of casting a Latina actress in the iconic role, believing they could check multiple diversity boxes while maintaining the story's timeless appeal. But behind the scenes, trouble began brewing before cameras even started rolling. Zegler's early press interviews sent shockwaves through the Disney executive suite.
The original cartoon came out in 1937, and very evidently so. There's a big focus on her love story with a guy who literally stalks her.
Yeah.
Weird.
When she repeatedly and publicly mocked the original 1937 classic, dismissing its central romance as problematic Stockholm Syndrome nonsense, and calling Prince Charming essentially a stalker. These weren't offhand comments made in passing. They were pointed, repeated critiques delivered with an almost activist fervor. What stunned executives most was Zegler's apparent lack of awareness that her comments weren't just criticizing some obscure film, but attacking one of the most cherished cultural artifacts in Disney's history, the very foundation stone of the animation empire. The situation escalated from bad PR to creative crisis when Zegler's personal views began fundamentally reshaping the project. The actress reportedly refused to perform certain scenes as written, demanding rewrites to remove any suggestion of romantic vulnerability or traditional fairy tale tropes. This created an irreconcilable creative schism. Screenwriters found themselves caught between honoring the story's legacy and satisfying their star's vision of a modern, empowered Snow White. The script went through 14 different drafts as writers attempted to bridge these opposing visions, resulting in a Frankenstein monster of a screenplay that veered wildly between slavish devotion to the original and heavy-handed modern commentary. The production became a case study in creative dysfunction. Veteran Disney animators complained that the film's soul had been hollowed out, replaced with what one called corporate-mandated girl boss platitudes. Meanwhile, progressive critics dismissed the changes as superficial pandering, the worst of both worlds. Test audiences recoiled at bizarre additions like Snow White giving lectures on systemic oppression to the dwarves, while simultaneously cringing at awkward attempts to preserve musical numbers from the original. The more Disney tried to please everyone, the more the project lost its identity entirely, a fatal miscalculation that would ultimately doom the entire live-action remake strategy. What began as simple miscasting had snowballed into a full-blown existential crisis for Disney's creative direction. Production became a case study in corporate filmmaking gone wrong. The budget ballooned to $310 million as scenes were constantly rewritten and reshot. At one point, Disney employed two competing directors, one pushing for classic Disney magic, the other demanding heavy-handed social commentary. Crew members described chaotic days where they'd film a traditional musical number in the morning, then shoot Snow White lecturing woodland animals about systemic oppression in the afternoon. The film's identity crisis became physically manifest in its bizarre visual style. Lavish practical sets clashed painfully with unfinished CGI that made the dwarves look like PlayStation 2 characters. The dam broke when unfinished footage leaked from disastrous test screenings. Clips showed jaw-dropping tonal whiplash. One moment, Snow White sang cheerfully with animals. The next, she delivered cringeworthy monologues about smashing the patriarchy. The rewritten ending, where she rejected the prince to focus on her career, felt like a slap in the face to generations of fans. Social media erupted with memes comparing the film to Hollywood's most infamous flops. But the real damage came from the financial fallout. Merchandise pre-orders plummeted 73%. Theme park bookings dropped 22%, and Disney Plus saw its first-ever subscriber decline as Boycott Disney trended worldwide. Behind closed doors, Disney executives faced their darkest hour. Emergency meetings stretched through the night as analysts presented terrifying projections. Snow White alone might lose $400 million, but the real crisis was the brand damage spreading like wildfire. Retailers refused to stock Snow White products. Families canceled Disney vacations. Most alarmingly, the backlash began infecting unrelated Disney properties. Marvel, Star Wars, and even Pixar saw unusual dips in engagement. The numbers painted an undeniable picture. Disney's core audience felt betrayed. CEO Bob Iger's emergency boardroom decision to terminate Disney's entire live-action remake division marked one of the most shocking corporate reversals in Hollywood history. A $575 million write-off that sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry. This wasn't just about canceling a few troubled projects. It was a full-scale retreat from a strategy that had generated billions for nearly a decade. The move came after internal projections revealed an even grimmer reality. Had Disney proceeded with its planned slate, the studio risked losing upwards of $1.8 billion in production costs, marketing, and most crucially, long-term brand erosion. Among the casualties was a fully completed Lilo and Stitch remake, which had tested at an astonishing 92% approval in early screenings. Despite its potential success, the film was abruptly shelved. Not because it was bad, but because Disney feared any association with its live-action brand might trigger audience backlash. Even more staggering was the overnight cancellation of Hercules, already $200 million deep into production, with elaborate sets built and A-list talent attached. The live-action version of Tangled that was in pre-production paused indefinitely. The sudden halt left hundreds of crew members in limbo, their work instantly rendered worthless. The human cost was equally devastating. Thousands of animators, VFX artists, and production staff were forcibly reassigned to Marvel and Star Wars projects, divisions already struggling with their own creative fatigue. Morale plummeted as veteran Disney employees, many of whom had spent years perfecting these adaptations, saw their passion projects discarded in an instant. But the most symbolic gesture came when Disney executives ordered the destruction of millions in unsold Snow White merchandise, dolls, costumes, and collectibles that had been manufactured in anticipation of a blockbuster. Warehouses full of products were shredded, melted down, or shipped to landfills. A physical purge of what had become, in Iger's own leaked memo, a catastrophic misreading of our audience. This wasn't merely a financial reckoning, it was a humiliating cultural surrender that shook Disney to its core. The studio's once unshakable faith in nostalgia's infinite marketability had crumbled spectacularly, revealing the fatal flaw in their strategy. You can't monetize childhood magic while simultaneously dismantling what made it magical. For decades, Disney had operated on the arrogant assumption that audiences would blindly accept increasingly hollow repackaging of their cherished memories, no matter how cynically executed or ideologically distorted. But the Snow White disaster proved there were limits, that even the most devoted fans would eventually revolt when their emotional connection to these stories was exploited rather than honored. The implications ran deeper than quarterly earnings. This was a spiritual crisis for a company that had built its empire on being the custodian of childhood wonder, the very alchemy that transformed cartoons into cultural touchstones, that turned animated frames into shared generational experiences, had been compromised by corporate greed and creative bankruptcy. As studio executives surveyed the wreckage of their live-action division, a terrifying question lingered in the silence of Burbank's boardrooms. Had they permanently broken the spell? Had decades of lazy remakes, soulless sequels, and factory-line content finally eroded Disney's most precious asset, the unconditional trust of its audience? The warning signs were everywhere. Parents hesitating before taking kids to Disneyland, families skipping Marvel movies they would have automatically attended just years before. A growing cultural perception that Disney had become just another corporation rather than a beloved storyteller. This wasn't just about one failed film franchise. It was about whether Walt Disney's century-old promise of quality, imagination, and emotional authenticity could survive in an era of algorithmic content churn and shareholder-first decision-making. The most painful realization? That Disney might have sacrificed its cultural immortality on the altar of short-term profits. The studio that had survived wars, economic depressions, and technological revolutions now faced its greatest threat, the very real possibility that it had taught audiences not to care anymore. As the last pieces of Snow White merchandise were hauled to landfills, the haunting truth became unavoidable. Disney's magic had always been more fragile than its executives believed, and no amount of corporate power could force it back into existence once lost. This collapse represents more than just bad business. It's a cultural reckoning. Audiences finally rejected the cynical recycling of childhood memories. The lesson for Disney and Hollywood is clear. True magic comes from authentic creativity, not corporate calculations. As the industry scrambles to adapt, one question looms largest. Can Disney rediscover the spark that made it legendary? Or is it doomed to keep chasing trends until the magic is gone forever? The answer will determine whether this is just a stumble or the beginning of the end for the house that Walt built.